I'm going to give you some tips to save money on food when you visit Washington, D.C. Hello, my name is Rob. I'm a tour guide and the founder of Trip Hacks DC Tours. On this channel, I share my best tips, tricks, and hacks for exploring Washington, D.C. And over at triphacksdc.com, you'll find info about tours and more. Food is a major expense on any trip, but eating your way through a city is also one of the best joys of traveling. So I've got some tips so that you can eat well when you visit DC without necessarily spending a fortune. Before we get into it, let me just say that some splurges are just worth it. If you really want to experience some of the best restaurants in Washington, D.C., you're probably just gonna have to pay full price to do it. But I also recognize that not everyone can splurge on every single meal. So hopefully these tips will help you get a little more bang for your buck. And after you're done watching the video, leave me a comment and let me know which of these tips resonates most with you. And while you're down there, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future Washington, D.C. travel or food tips videos. With that said, let's get started. My first tip is to cheap out on breakfast. Now, I know that some people don't even eat breakfast, while other people believe it's very important to eat a full breakfast every day. But regardless of your feelings about breakfast in theory, the reality is that for most restaurants, breakfast is not the most interesting meal, which is why there aren't any restaurants earning Michelin stars for their breakfast menus. So I think it's perfectly fine to cheap out on breakfast, whether that means staying at a hotel that has an included breakfast or getting a cheap breakfast from a greasy spoon diner or even a coffee shop. Which leads to my next tip, which is make lunch your splurge meal. Now, many of the highest end restaurants in DC, including much of the Michelin star list, don't even open for lunch. But there are still plenty of great restaurants that serve both lunch and dinner. And in many cases, the menus are very similar between the two, with lunch prices a little bit less expensive. It's also usually easier to get a lunch reservation than a dinner reservation. So when I travel, when possible, I try to make lunch my splurge meal. Then I eat dinner at a much more modest fast casual restaurant, which is advantageous for two reasons. First, prices at fast casual restaurants are the same all day long. Second, if my lunch splurge winds up being a huge meal, I can eat dinner whenever I want, since I'm not bound to a reservation at a specific time. The other reason to do your splurge meal at lunch is that you're less likely to get upsold on alcohol, which during dinner at restaurants in DC is not cheap. Which leads right into my next tip, which is get drinks at happy hour. Now, depending on where you live, happy hour might not even be a thing. But in DC, happy hour is kind of an institution. Happy hour is not just a single hour. It usually runs from sometime around the end of the workday until the beginning of the dinner rush. At some places, it's 4 to 6. At others, 5 to 7. It really varies. Now, you're much more likely to find good happy hours at bars rather than full-service restaurants. But in DC, most bars also serve food, so it's possible you might not just find drink specials, but food specials there. And I know everyone will say, okay, Rob, well then where are all the best happy hour spots? There have been many attempts to collect and publish this data over the years. But it's really hard because happy hours are constantly changing and evolving. So what I suggest doing is, while you're out and about during the day, look and see if any places you walk past have a sign advertising happy hour. And if it looks good to you, make a note of it and come back later. That way you get the added fun of the element of discovery. Now, like I said, you'll mostly find happy hours at bars, but you'll also find them occasionally at fast casual restaurants. Which leads to my next tip, which is take advantage of fast casual. I personally love fast casual restaurants because they're delicious and relatively inexpensive. And Washington, D.C. has a huge concentration of excellent fast casual. Unlike a restaurant, you don't have a server, so you'll order from the counter. And yes, that includes your happy hour drinks too. I have a video with some of my favorite cheap eats if you're looking for suggestions. And if you aren't already, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, as I plan to do some more fast casual videos in the future. Okay, now this next tip might be controversial, but here it is. Be careful with weekend brunch. Just like happy hour, brunch is a bit of an institution in DC. Lots of people love brunch, but I think generally it's for the social aspect of it, not the food. Brunch places in DC go heavy on alcohol, which is fine if you're meeting up with friends and want to spend a few hours hanging out and having a fun time. But if you're looking for actual good food and don't want to be hungover at 3 in the afternoon, brunch might not be a good choice. And my last tip is, be honest with yourself when it comes to cooking. Last year, I did a podcast episode with Jocelyn from Walter's World, and one of the things that came up was this question about buying groceries and cooking your own food. Now, for some people, this is the single best way you can save money on a trip, as cooking for yourself is way less expensive than eating at restaurants. But you have to be really honest here. Do you actually want to cook? Are you actually going to cook? Or are you going to buy a fridge full of food that you wind up throwing out at the end of the trip because you are either too tired or got too enticed by all the delicious restaurant options? For me, cooking is something that I do every day, but that means it's kind of a chore. And frankly, the last thing that I want to do when I'm on a vacation. But that's just me. You might not be as interested in restaurants as I am. You might not consider yourself a foodie, or you might just love to cook no matter the time or place. The key thing is you just have to be honest with yourself about whether this is a good idea or not. But you know what's always a good idea? Watching another Trip Hacks DC video, which you can click or tap right over here to see the next one. And if you're coming to Washington, DC and interested in signing up for a Trip Hacks DC guided tour, you can click or tap on the Capitol Dome on the left side of my head. That'll send you right over to triphacksdc.com, where you can see all of the tours that we offer. Enjoy your trip!